Hello grade 11s and welcome to Learn Extra. In today's lesson we're going to be having a look at solving quadratic equations. Now there are three different methods that we can use to solve a quadratic equation. The first one you guys have already met, and that is quite simply just by factorizing the trinomial. Now factorizing the trinomial we can only do if it's something that's factorizable. The other two methods, which are completing the square and use of the quadratic formula, those can be used in any case. Right, so let's get started. Remember now your options. You can solve a quadratic equation by factorizing the trinomial, by completing the square, and by using the quadratic formula. It is very, very important that before you attempt any of these methods, you make sure that your quadratic equation is in standard form. That is the form ax squared plus bx plus c equal to 0. So all the terms in descending power of x on the left-hand side and a 0 on the right-hand side. Now we're going to start with the easiest methods, which you guys have definitely seen before, and that is by factorizing. And we're not going to spend too much time on this because I know you guys will be bored within seconds. Right. Here's an example of factorizing. We are given a trinomial which is already in standard form, x squared minus x minus 12 equal to 0. So what do? Well, we make our two brackets and we look at the factors of 12 that could possibly give us a 1 in the middle. We're going to be using positive 3 and negative 4. Remember guys, there's no reason to ever get this wrong because you can check your solution by multiplying out again mentally. If you check x times x is x squared, plus 3 times minus 4 is minus 12, 3x in the middle, minus 4x for my outer terms, so that checks out. That definitely works. And then I put each of these brackets equal to 0 individually. Of course, this step you don't need to show, but you can if you want to. You say x plus 3 is equal to 0, so therefore x is equal to negative 3, and x minus 4 is equal to 0, therefore x is equal to 4. Now, at this point in grade 11, to some of you this might seem relatively unexciting, and I would have to agree with you, but guys, it is so important that you learn these skills properly because later on in the year, you're going to be applying these skills to parabolas. A quadratic equation is in fact a formula for a graph that looks like that or like that. And what we are really doing by getting these answers for x is we are getting the places where this graph cuts the x-axis. Now, you don't really have to know too much about that at this point, but it's nice to know that this is going to go into something bigger and more exciting. Right, let's just quickly have a look at another one that we're going to factorize, and then we'll go on to the more complicated methods. What about this one? X squared plus x minus 6 equal to 0. Right, so again, we're going to make our two brackets. And now we have to think of the factors of 6 that could possibly give us a 1 in the middle. And what we're going to be using is positive 3, because overall I want my answer to be positive, and negative 2. Remember, you can multiply back out to make sure that it works. X and x, x squared, positive 3 and negative 2 gives me the minus 6, and my middle term also works. So therefore my solutions are x is equal to minus 3 and x is equal to 2. Now guys, if we ask you to solve a quadratic equation and we don't specify which method you must use, and it looks like something that can easily be factorized, such as these two examples that I did just now. This is definitely the quickest and the easiest method to use, but you have to know them all because they're going to serve different purposes later on. Right, now we're going to move on to completion of the square. Now, if you solve an equation by completing the square, you're going to be following a very, very set method. It's not hard, but you need to remember what the steps are and you need to execute them correctly. Now, let's have a look at our first example. This one's not very hard. It really isn't too bad. The first step when you're completing the square will be to make sure that the coefficient of x squared is 1. Now, in this example, the coefficient of x squared is already 1, so it's a relatively simple example, not to worry. Then what you do is you have a look at your constant term. My constant term in this case is -1. And you move the constant term over the equals. So step 1, move your constant term over the equals, get rid of it, right? Well, you're not really getting rid of it because it's still there, but it's not on the left-hand side. And remember, when you take it over the equals, the sign changes. Then you're going to have a look at the coefficient of x. That's the number standing in front of x, and the number in front of x in this case is -2. What you're going to do with that number is you're going to halve it, square it, and add it both sides, right? So this was step 1, move constant. My second step is to halve, square, and add both sides. And this is now actually where I am busy completing the square. So I say half of -2 is -1. When I square -1, it gives me +1, and it will always be a positive number that you're adding in here. Now, at this point, what I've done is I've tampered with my equation. And remember, guys, the golden rule with equations, whatever you do on the one side must also be done on the other. So I'm also going to put a +1 on the right-hand side. Now, by doing this step, what you have done is you have created a complete square on your left-hand side. So this x squared minus 2x plus 1 is a complete square. What does it mean? It means it can be factorized into one bracket squared. In other words, two identical terms will emerge from here. Let's check. X minus 1, everything squared will give me that if I multiply it back out. So the next step, step number 3, is now to factorize the left-hand side. Right, all done, and let's just add the 1 and 1 together on that side, and that gives me 2. Step number 4 is now to take the square root on both sides. And remember, we're still being true to our rules for equations. As long as I take the square root on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, I'm not changing the properties of my equation. So step number 4, we're going to square root. Right, let's get a different color pen going here. Square root and square root. Right, so the answer for the square root of x minus 1, everything squared, is quite simply just x minus 1. Now remember, guys, because this is a quadratic equation, because I'm dealing with an x squared, I need 2 answers for x. Now, if you just write on the right-hand side equals square root of 2, you're only going to get one solution. So what you need to remember is that you have to say plus or minus 2. So that is the square rooting bit. Your next step is now just, let's call that step number 5, solve. And what I like to do is I like to do the 2 two answers separately. So I'm going to say, right, my one solution is x minus 1 equal to the square root of 2. And my other solution is x minus 1 equal to the negative square root of 2. Getting x on its own on the left-hand side, I'm going to say x is equal to 1 plus root 2. And on this side, x is equal to 1 minus root 2. Now, at this point in the question, you'll have to have a look at the instructions. If the instructions said, leave your answer in simplest third form rather, then this is perfectly okay. However, they might say give your answers correct to 1 decimal place or 2 decimal places, and in that case, we're going to bring up our calculator. So 1 plus square root of 2 equals, and that is 2,41. Let's do it to 2 decimal places. 2,41. And then 1 minus the square root of 2. And that is minus 0,41. Right. Now, I think you guys will agree with me. Let me just write this one down first. Minus 0,41. That this particular example, there is no way that you would have been able to factorize this quadratic equation just by factorizing the trinomial. Because, guys, look at the answers. They are decimal numbers. So completion of the square is the first method that we get where we can solve the equation even if it's not something that factorizes beautifully. Right, now I just want us to have a look at one more example before we move on. You don't have this example in front of you, but that really doesn't matter. So let's say we have something like 2x squared plus 3x minus 2 equal to 0. Now, what makes this example different than the previous one? Well, it's got the coefficient of 2. And I can't get rid of this 2 in an easy way because 2 doesn't just go into all of these numbers. Now, guys, you will still have to, remember I said to you guys, the first step is you've got to make sure that the coefficient of x squared is 1. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to divide through by 2, even though it might not exactly be pretty. So I'm going to do that. So this now changes my equation to x squared plus 3 over 2 x. This becomes minus 1, and I'm going to do the other step already where I take the constant to the other side. Now, guys, it's important that even if you are dealing with fractions, please don't get freaked out. I know you guys don't love the fractions, but the steps stay the same, and if you can comfort yourself with that, then you'll do a lot better. Right, so the next step, remember we said first, get the constant term over, get the coefficient of x squared to be 1. Our next step is to halve, to square, and to add both sides. Now, you could say, ooh, what is half of 3 over 2? And of course, you guys have got your Casio calculators with you, so you can go 1,5 divided by 2. But guys, all we're really doing by halving is we are multiplying with a half. So if I multiply 3 over 2 with a half, I get 3 over 4. But now I've still got to square it. Like that. And I've got to add it on the other side. It sometimes makes it easier if you, especially if it's a fraction, if you just leave it like with the square at the top. So now factorizing this side, it's going to be x. Remember, your sign is governed by that middle sign because this will always be positive. So now because this sign is positive, it'll be plus, and it will be 3/4. And guys, you can check this by multiplying out if you want to. You will get back to that exactly. Now on the other side, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to tidy things up a little bit. Now, the 3/4 squared gives me 9 over 16. And because I'm going to have to take the square root just now, I'm going to make this one term. So what you could do is say 1 plus 9 over 16, or if you're more old school like me, you can also just get a common denominator. But let's use the calculator. I know you guys will. 9 over 16. And that's the beauty of this calculator. It gives you the answer beautifully like that. So let's take that away. It's 25 over 16. 25 over 16. Okay, so now that I've done my halving, my squaring, my adding both sides, my next step that I showed you guys is to take the square root on both sides. So let's do that, square root that side and square root that side. And this one actually works out very nicely. The square root of x plus 3/4 everything squared is quite simply just x plus 3/4. And now we've got to remember plus and minus on the right-hand side. So the square root of 25 over 16 is 5 over 4. And it's plus and minus 5 over 4. Now we're just going to get on with the business of solving, and I'm going to say, right, my one solution is x equal to negative 3/4 plus 5 over 4, which gives me 2 over 4, which is a half. And my other solution is x is equal to negative 3/4 minus 5 over 4. And this gives me negative 8 over 4, which is negative 2. Now, guys, the fact that my answers work out to be non-decimal like they do here means that the original equation could have been factorized just by factorizing the trinomial. But anyway, that doesn't matter. So that's the method for completing the square. Coefficient of x squared must be 1. Constant term to the other side. Look at the coefficient of x, halve it, square it, add it both sides. Right, then you factorize, then you take the square root on both sides, remembering to do the plus and minus, and then you're just going to solve for x. So this is factorizing by completing the square. I just want to show you guys one other thing as well. In this case, we had a quadratic equation. It definitely said to me on the right-hand side, I had, if I just get the equation back, where is it now? Yes, I've got 2x squared plus 3x minus 2 equal to 0. Right. The question could also be slightly different, and it's important that we make that distinction. The question could have been 2x squared plus 3x minus 2. So let's just do that. Write it again. 2x squared plus 3x minus 2. And if there is no equal to 0 on the right-hand side, guys, then it's not an equation. So what they can do is they can say, take the expression 2x squared plus 3x minus 2 and write it in the form, and this is something that's going to happen quite frequently once you guys do graph, write it in that form. Now, the only thing that's really different when they ask us to write this expression in that form and there's no equal to 0 on the right-hand side, guys, you must then remember that we don't have two sides of an equation to work with. That is very, very important. So I can't take the minus 2 to the other side because there quite simply just is no other side. So we're going to have to go about this slightly differently, and I'm going to show you guys how in a minute. Now, firstly, remember just now when this was still an equation, to get a 1 coefficient for the x squared, what I did was I divided the whole equation through by 2. Now guys, I can't do that now because there is no other side. So what I'm going to have to do is take 2 out as a common factor. So please guys, just don't get confused. This is what I do if they ask me to write it in a certain form, but it is not equal to 0. Right, so the minus 2, that becomes minus 1. Now another thing that now happens is that minus 1 cannot be moved to the other side because there is no other side. So you just kind of move it out of the way a little bit. The rest of the steps are pretty much still the same. We're going to keep the 2 there. Then I'm going to take the 3 over 2, which is the coefficient of x. I'm going to halve it and square it. So that's 3/4. But remember, the rule said halve it, square it, add it both sides. But this is not an equation. So now there is no both sides. What do? I can't just change the properties of the equation. So what I will do is I will say, right, I've added 9 over 16. So now I'm also going to subtract 9 over 16. And I'll keep that all inside the bracket like that. So I haven't changed the properties of the actual expression, which is great. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a 2. I'm going to do a square bracket, and I'm going to factorize that part. That gives me x plus 3/4, everything squared. And I'm just going to work out what I have on this side. So that was minus 1 minus 9 over 16 is going to give me minus 25 over 16. And then what you can do is just multiply this 2 in. So I'm not going to multiply it right into the bracket. But remember, this 2 also pertains to that side. So this becomes minus 50 over 16. So very important with completion of the square questions. If there's an equal to 0, it's an equation. If there, however, isn't an equal to 0 and they ask you to write it in this form, that's now exactly what I've done. So please, guys, just make sure that you don't get confused between those two. Right, so the next thing that I told you guys we're going to be doing today, our third method, is the quadratic formula. So let's have a look at the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is x is equal to negative b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, and obviously a cannot be 0 because then we'll be dividing by 0. Now guys, the quadratic formula is one of those things that when you meet it the first time, you think you're never going to remember it. Don't worry, you don't have to. It'll appear on your information sheet with any test that you write, but I can promise you, by the time you get to the end of matric, you won't even have to look at this guy. Let me just quickly show you guys how to apply the quadratic formula. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at exactly the same example, the first example for completing the square. Remember, our two answers were 1 minus root 2 and 1 plus root 2. So I'm going to apply the quadratic formula to that same equation just to show you guys that we get the same answers. The equation was x squared minus 2x minus 1 equal to 0. A is the coefficient of x squared, so if this makes it easier for you, write it out. A is equal to 1. B is the coefficient of x. B is then minus 2. And C is the constant term, and in this case, it is minus 1. Our quadratic formula says x is equal to minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. And I think if you have a choice, the quadratic formula is definitely easier than completing the square. There's not so much to remember. It's just a case of putting your values in. Right. So b is negative 2. Now the equation asks for minus b, so it's going to be minus minus 2, which of course will become a plus. And then plus or minus b squared minus 4ac. So b is negative 2, square it, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is minus 1. All of that divided by 2a, and that's 2 times 1. So that's 2, plus or minus. To work out the inside of the bracket, I have minus 2 squared, which is 4, and this gives me plus another 4, so that's 8 over 2. Now, the square root of 8 is 2 root 2. You guys might not even know this because you're so lucky with your calculators. Okay, and now taking out a common 2 at the top, I'm left with 1 plus or minus root 2 over 2. The 2's cancel, and do you guys see my solutions are then 1 plus root 2 and 1 minus root 2. Right, guys, so 3 methods: factorizing, completion of the square, and use of the quadratic formula. And guys, you've got to make sure that you are able to do all of those. Right, so let's quickly have a look at our questions in the exercise. Question 1 deals with the completion of the square. And we are asked to write the following expressions in the form a x plus p squared plus q. Right, so that's that second type of completion of the square that I showed you guys. Do you see there is no equal to 0 here? So I don't have any other side. Very, very important, but not difficult at all. First one, x squared minus 8x plus 10. X squared minus 8x plus 10. Okay, remember, no other side because it's not equal to 0. Fortunately, though, my coefficient of x squared is already 1, so that makes things a little bit easier. Right. At the moment, what is bugging me slightly here is this 10. I can't move it to the other side, so I'll just move it away a little bit. Remember, its sign doesn't change. I'm just really making a space for myself. Now I have a look at the coefficient of x. It is minus 8. And I halve it. Half of minus 8 is minus 4. Then I square it, so my answer will always end up being positive, and that gives me 16. But now, what have I done? I've changed the properties of the expression by adding 16. You can't just add 16. So what I'm going to do, to counteract that adding of the 16, I'm also going to subtract the 16. Remember, if it's an equation, you just add it both sides and then it balances out. If it's not an equation, there is no other side. So you just move it away, add it, and subtract it. Right, guys, we are now ready to factorize this. It's going to factorize into x minus 4, everything squared, and then 10 minus 16 is minus 6. Now, because it's not an equation, we are not going to get an answer. Remember, we were asked just to do something. We were asked to write it in the form a x minus p squared plus q. So if you want, we can say, well, a, the coefficient of my bracket, is 1, p is 4, and q is minus 6, but that's not even required. The next question is similar to this one, but it's slightly more difficult. And what makes it slightly more difficult is the fact that we're dealing with a coefficient there. I've got a 2x squared, but not a problem. Remember, if it was an equation, I would have divided by 2. Now, unfortunately, because it isn't an equation, I cannot divide by 2, but what I can do is I can take 2 out as a common factor. So let's do it. 2x squared minus 7x plus 6 equal to 0. So our first step is going to be to take 2 out as a common factor. Right, make sure that you do it correctly. You don't want to start your question on a disadvantage. Remember also, guys, if I now multiply this 2 back into the bracket, obviously I must get back to the original expression, otherwise I made a mistake. Now I have a look at the coefficient of x. The coefficient of x is 7 over 2, and I halve it. Half of 7 over 2 is 7 over 4. I just multiply by a half. So I'm going to say plus 7 over 4. The other rule is that I must square it. And because I don't have an equation now, and I don't have 2 sides to work with, I'm just going to subtract the 7 over 4 squared as well. And remember, that's all still inside the bracket with the 2 on the outside. Right, so let's factorize this part of the expression now. At this point, I like to put a square bracket and a round bracket. That is just so that I remember that this 2 isn't only for the factorized bracket, but that it also is for the constant terms at the end over there. So this is going to be x. The sign of your bracket is governed by the middle term. So the middle term there is a minus, so it's going to be minus and 7 over 4 squared. Then I've got positive 3 minus 49 over 16. Now, of course, it's quite possible to work out what positive 3 minus 49 over 16 is, but in our case, in your case, you would probably just want to use your calculator. Right, I'm going to not use my calculator, however, because I've lost my calculator. And I think that's a really good idea at this point. Keeps me nice and awake. So I'm going to get a common denominator of 16. Remember, that's 3 over 1. So I say, what does 1 have to be multiplied with in order to get it to 16? It has to be multiplied by 16. So then 3 times 16 is 48. So I've got plus 48 minus 49 over 16. And now, right, so let's just do this in one step. So 48 minus 49 gives me minus 1/16, but if I multiply the 2 in, it becomes minus 2/16, but minus 2/16 is actually minus 1/8 if I write it in the simplest form. So if anybody asks, A is 2, P is 7 over 4, and Q is minus 1 over 8. Right, guys, so that's question 1A and B. Remember, you would do the question differently if it's not an equation. Now, the next one, question 2, is actually an equation, so all our original rules will still apply. Let's have a look at question 2. Right, so question 2 says, solve for x by completing the square, and it's equal to 0. So I know for a fact that this is definitely an equation. So let's do it. Guys, now this one it looked like it might be slightly more complicated because of the coefficient of x squared being 2. But because all of the other numbers are even numbers, it's actually going to be very easy. I'm just going to divide through by 2. So it becomes x squared minus 4x minus 2, and all of that is equal to 0. Right. Now, guys, you need to remember your steps. First step, coefficient of x squared must be 1. The second step is to take your constant term and move it to the other side. Let's do that. Right. Then we have a look at the coefficient of x. That's the number that is being multiplied with x. And the coefficient of x in this case is negative 4. So you take your coefficient of x, you halve it. you square it, and you add it both sides, because we do have both sides now. It's an equation. So half of minus 4 is minus 2. Minus 2 squared is plus 4. And plus 4 on the other side as well. Remember, because you are squaring, it is always going to be a plus. Now we're going to get on with the business of factorizing our bracket here on the left-hand side. Nothing too difficult. Remember, because that's a minus, my bracket will be a minus. All of that squared, and you can quite happily check if you square out this bracket, you will get x squared minus 4x plus 4. Right, and then 2 plus 4 on the right-hand side is equal to 6. Now, I hope you guys can remember what the next step is. If you don't, go back to your rules, but I think it's almost crying out for us to take the square root both sides. So if we square root a square, the square simply disappears. So on the left-hand side, I have x minus 2, and that's it. You don't even really have to write the bracket anymore. Remember though, on the right-hand side, plus or minus root 6. This is a quadratic equation, so we want two solutions. And our final step is now just to solve, and I'm going to say, right, x is equal to 2 plus root 6, and x is equal to 2 minus root 6. And guys, this is the simplest third form. So in most cases, depending on what the question says, if they say correct to 2 decimal places or whatnot, you would put it into your calculator. But at this point, you could just leave it like this. Right, guys, so I hope you've had success with completing the square in question 2. In question 3, we've got solve the following equations. Now, let's read the questions together. Now, they don't actually tell us how we have to solve them. We are not given any specific instructions. We're not told it must be in simplest third form. We're not told that we have to use any particular method. Now, when I first looked at this, with 13 and 2 both being prime numbers, it was my immediate thought that I don't think this is going to factorize. And I thought, well, either I'll have to complete the square or I'll have to use the quadratic formula. Now, guys, this does actually factorize quite nicely, and I'm going to show you guys how in a minute. So it is 15x squared minus 13x plus 2 equal to 0. So if your factorizing is good, you will save yourself quite a lot of time in the exam. This one factorizes like this: 5x minus 1 and 3x minus 2 equal to 0, which means then my solutions are x is a fifth and x is 2/3. So guys, if at all possible, and you're not told to do anything in particular, try and factorize it. If it works, how long did that take me? All of 2 seconds. But now I'm going to show you guys that even if I use either of the other 2 methods, I must still get the same answers, 1/5 and 2/3. Now, I'm not doing this to punish you, but it's always good practice. Let's get some extra practice in the quadratic formula and in completion of the square. So let's do completion of the square first, because I really think that of all the 3 methods, that's the hardest and probably requires the most practice. So the first step in completion of the square is that we have to get the coefficient of x squared to be 1. So I've got this 15 in front, which is not very pleasant. I'm going to have to get rid of it by dividing by 15. And guys, if you're pulling a face, I can completely understand it. This looks nasty. Anyway, so I've now got x squared minus 13 over 15 x, And this 2/15 I'm going to move to the other side. Remember, guys, I'm not recommending that you use this method, please. If you're given a choice and it's possible to factorize, but we're just getting in as much practice as possible. Right, so I've halved the 13 over 15. I've squared it. I've added it on this side. I also need to add it on this side. I'm running out of space a little bit here, but that's fine. I'm just going to put it here underneath. Remember, guys, by adding the same thing on both sides of the equation, what you are doing is you are keeping the equation the same. Right, so let's factorize our left-hand side. So this is going to be x minus 13 over 30. Everything squared. Now, what I need to do is I need to work out the right-hand side of my equation. And these numbers are ugly, so I'm definitely just going to use my calculator. So that is going to be minus 2 over 15 plus, open a bracket, fraction 13 over 30. And all of that is squared. And my answer is 49 over 900. Now, this is already looking kind of promising to me. Why? Because 49 square root is 7, and 900 square root is 30. So at least I know I'm on the right track. And this is then equal to 49 over 900. Right. So I've got x minus 13 over 30, everything squared, equal to 49 over 900. Now, we've been so busy with these difficult numbers that we might have forgotten our method, but remember, guys, this guy is crying out to be square rooted on both sides. So let's do it. So x minus 13 over 30 is equal to plus or minus 7 over 30. The square root of 49 is 7, and the square root of 900 is 30. Right, so let's write down our two solutions. X is equal to 13 over 30 plus 7 over 30, and x is equal to 13 over 30 minus 7 over 30. And I'm starting to get very excited, guys, because I can see I'm going to get the same answers. The first solution gives me 20 over 30, which simplifies to 2/3. And that's exactly what I got in a lot less time by factorizing the trinomial. And the other solution is x is equal to 13 minus 7 is 6. So 6 over 30, but 6 goes into 6 once, and 6 goes into 35 times. And there we have it, guys. So it can really be avoided. You didn't have to do all of this work, but we need to practice completion of the square, so just as well we did. Right, so we're going to do this in one more method, and we're going to do it now using the quadratic formula. Again, the answers we are looking for, 2/3 and 1/5. 15x squared minus 13x plus 2 equal to 0. Right, so I'm going to write down the quadratic formula. X is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all of that divided by 2a. So b is the coefficient of x, and in this case it's 13, so it's minus 13, which is going to be plus, then plus or minus negative 13 squared minus 4 times a, which is 15, and c, which is 2, and all of that divided by 2 times a, and that's then 2 times, sorry, it's 2 times 15, which is 30. So let's just write the 30 there straight away. Now already I think you guys can see that this is somewhat quicker than my previous method. 13 plus or minus, right guys? 13 squared is 169 plus 120, have I got it right? Let's rather use our calculator. 4 times 15. Sorry. So we've got 13 squared, and that's 169, right? Then added to that, I have, it's actually subtracted from that, minus 120, yes, and that gives me my 49, which I had just now, so that's all good. So that gives me 49 over 30, and that's still inside the square root. Right, guys? Then we take the square root, and again, our answers are going to be 13 plus 7 over 30, which simplifies down to 2/3, and 13 minus 7 over 30, which simplifies to 1 over 5. So one question, 3 different ways. Right, guys, we've now practiced all of our methods in question 3A. Let's have a look at question 3B. The question tells us 2x and then a bracket, x minus 4 equal to 8. And they just say solve it and give your answer in the simplest surd form. Now, the fact that our answer has to be in simplest surd form means that we either have to use completion of the square or the quadratic formula. It probably won't be possible to factorize that. In fact, it won't be. The moment there's a surd in the answer, it won't be. So I'm going to do this one again just in the 2 different ways. So let's get started on that. Of course, guys, the very first step is that you've got to make sure your equation is in simplest, is in standard form rather, in simplest standard form actually, yes. Right, so we're going to multiply out these brackets, and that's going to give me 2x squared minus 8x, and let's bring that 8 over to this side. Right, now I'm going to divide by 2, so I get x squared minus 4x minus 4 is equal to 0. Now, although it actually looks like this can be factorized quite easily, the fact that this is a minus and not a plus makes that this won't factorize. If this was a plus, if the final sign was a plus, then it would have been x minus 2, everything squared. But unfortunately, it's not. So now we're going to quickly complete the square on this guy. So completing the square, unfortunately, now means that the 4 must go back to the other side. So obviously you didn't have to show this step if you knew you were going to do completion of the square. Right, so check out the coefficient of x, halve it, square it, add it both sides. Half of minus 4 is minus 2 squared is 4. And for both sides. Factorize your left-hand side, x minus 2 squared, and add together the terms on the right-hand side, that's 8. Okay, next step, square root. So this becomes x minus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 8. So my solutions are going to be x is equal to 2 plus the square root of 8, and x is 2 minus the square root of 8. But guys, this actually isn't the simplest surd form. 8 can be further simplified into 2 root 2. So 2 plus 2 root 2, square root of 8 can be simplified into 2 root 2. And x is equal to 2 minus 2 root 2. Right, so guys, this wasn't a hard completion of the square, and what you'll find also is as long as there aren't any fractions and you know your method, you can probably get it done quite quickly. Let's also substitute this one into the quadratic formula just to make sure we get the same answer. Right, so this was 2x squared minus 8x minus 8 equal to 0, which is x squared minus 4x minus 4 equal to 0. I'm going to now substitute this into the quadratic formula. X is equal to minus b, so that's minus 4, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so that's minus 4 squared, minus 4 times a, that's the coefficient of x squared, which is 1, c, which is minus 4. All of this is divided by 2a, which is just 2 times 1. So I get 4 plus or minus the square root of 16, and then 16 plus 16, so that's actually going to be 32. So far, 4 plus or minus the square root of 32 over 2. Now I'm going to use my calculator. 4 plus the square root of 32 over 2. And my answer is 2 plus 2 root 2, which is exactly what I wanted. And then 4 minus the square root of 32 over 2. And again, I get the same answer as I did previously. So I can be pretty sure that I did this one correctly. Right, let's have a look at the last question in question 3, 3c. And let's devise a plan to calculate this one. We've got x minus 5 equal to 2 over x, and the fact that we are told that our answer must be rounded to 2 decimal digits means only completing the square and the formula could possibly work. Now, I'm going to do it by completion of the square, not because I'm recommending that you guys do it. It is harder than the formula, but because completion of the square is harder than the formula, I want you guys to get as much practice as possible. Right, the first thing we need to do is to get this equation into standard form. So what I need to do is I'm going to have to multiply through by x. Okay, so multiplying through by x gives me x squared minus 5x and then equal to 2. And because I'm using completion of the square, I'm just going to leave it like that. I'm not going to bring them all over because the first step in completion of the square anyhow is moving the number to the other side. Right, so now I have a look at the coefficient of x. I have got to halve it, square it, and add it both sides. Half of 5 is 5 over 2, and I'm going to square it and also add it to the other side. Right, let's factorize the left-hand side. X minus 5 over 2, everything squared, is equal to 2 plus 25 over 4. So if I write 2 over 4, then it's going to be 8 over 4, right? Yes. And then it's going to give me 33 over 4. Guys, feel free to use your calculator. Now at this point, my next step is to take the square root on both sides. I've done that, so let's get rid of this bracket. It's going to be x minus 5 over 2. What did I say? Get rid of the bracket, and then I don't. Gone bracket, equal to plus or minus the square root of 33 over 4. Now, guys, the fact we're going to be using our calculator pretty soon because they said we must round off to 2 decimal digits. So it's x is 5 over 2 plus root 33 over 4, and x is 5 over 2 minus root 33 over 4. Right, let's get out the calculator. 5 over 2 is 2.5, so I'm just going to do that. 2.5 plus the square root of 33 over 4 and that is 5.37. 5.37, and then of course I've got to do the other one as well, so that's 2.5 minus square root of 33 over 4, and that is negative 0.37. Negative 0.37. So not too bad, guys. Now at this point, I think you guys have gotten a lot of practice in completion of the square, and I hope that's going to stand you in good stead later on in the year when you've got to do your graphs. Now, question 4 is actually a little bit of a revision question from our first lesson, and it deals with the number system. Real numbers, rational numbers. Remember all of that? Right. So we're going to, let's have a look at this expression firstly. They ask us all sorts of things. We've got the square root of 1 minus x, and that is divided by 2x minus 3. And the first thing that they want to know is for which values of x is the expression undefined. Now guys, I need you to remember that undefined goes hand in hand with a 0 in the denominator. And undefined and non-real are not the same things. 0 in the denominator, undefined. Negative under the square root, non-real. Okay? Don't use those two terms interchangeably. They are not the same thing. So the first thing that you will think to yourself when you look at this question is they say to us, determine the values of x for which the expression is undefined. And you're going to ask yourself, right, what must x be in order for the denominator of my expression to be 0? So remember, undefined goes with divide by 0. So the only part that we are actually interested in is that part, the 2x minus 4. The 2x minus 4, let's just move it up. The 2x minus 4, the denominator is what makes the expression undefined. So I want to know for which values of x will that 2x minus 3 be equal to 0. And that is exactly what I'm going to do here. I'm going to say, well, the expression is undefined when I divide by 0. That's the first thing. And how am I going to find out when will I be dividing by 0? Well, I will say to myself, 2x minus 3 equal to 0. So that gives me that 2x is equal to 3. And therefore x is equal to 3 over 2. So if I substitute 3 over 2 into the place of x over here, then I'm going to get a 0 in the denominator, and remember, a 0 in the denominator is undefined. So my answer for A is x is equal to 3 over 2. Right. The next question asks me, for which values of x will this expression be equal to 0? Now, this particular expression will be equal to 0 if I've got a 0 at the top. Remember, there can't be a 0 at the bottom. We've already said that. That happens when x is equal to 3 over 2. So what does that mean? That means that portion of my equation, the top part of my equation, must be equal to 0, okay? So that also means that 1 minus x must be equal to 0. Because remember, if I have a 0 underneath the square root, the answer is 0 anyway. So for question B, to determine when this expression is going to be equal to 0, I take that portion under the square root and I make it equal to 0. So that gives me minus x is minus 1, so x is 1. So when x is 1, let's write it there. When x is equal to 1, the square root, the part underneath the square root is 0, so the square root of 0 is 0, and then the entire expression is 0. But remember, guys, a 0 at the top just means the expression is 0. That's fine. 0 in the numerator, absolutely fine. It's a 0 in the denominator, which makes the expression undefined. Right. The next question asks us, for which values of x will this expression be real? Okay, so I said to you guys that undefined goes with a 0 in the denominator. Non-real goes with a negative under the square root. So, as long as there isn't a negative under the square root, this expression will be real. So what am I going to say? I'm going to say underneath the square root, I've got 1 minus x. So 1 minus x must be greater than or equal to 0. Greater than or equal to 0. And now I'm going to solve that inequality. So negative x must be greater than or equal to negative 1. Now, in order to solve for x, boys and girls, I'm now going to have to divide by a minus. And I need you guys to remember that when you divide by a minus, what happens to my inequality? The sign switches around. So what is my solution? My solution says that as long as x is less than or equal to 1, then my expression will be real. And if I want to depict that on a number line, what I'll do is I'll make a 1, a closed dot, and I'll say all of those will make it real. Now the next question says, well, when will it be non-real? Well, it'll be non-real when it's not real, right? So when will this expression be non-real? It will be for all of these values that I indicate over there in the pink, right? So it will be non-real for all of the values indicated in the pink, except at 3 over 2, we must remember that we've already said at 3 over 2 it is undefined. Right, guys, so I think you can see how important it is that you know your number system. Now, this question doesn't even deal with rational and irrational numbers, but remember, for a rational number, it's a number that can be written in the form a over b, and that's a non-terminating, non-repeating decimal. Now, if you guys have a look at your homework, and I'm just going to give you guys a couple of hints here. Question 1 in your homework, it tells you to solve for x. Now, guys, in that particular question, nobody tells you which method you can and cannot use. I want to ask you guys to do every question in at least 2 different methods. That will make sure that you know factorizing, completing of the square, and using the formula. Then question 2a in the homework deals again with a square root. So let's just quickly talk about that for a second. They ask us, for which values will this be real? And remember, non-real is a negative under the square root. So bear that in mind when you do that homework. Right, guys, I hope you've learned a lot from Learn Extra today. Please, guys, do your homework, be diligent, and we'll see you next time.